Good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's webinar and podcast series, Israel Insider with Ashley Perry. I'm Stacey Roman, and I will be moderating this discussion today. We're pleased to have Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, join us here each week to update us on all the events going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will be giving us a briefing on current Israeli affairs for 15 minutes, then open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I will turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Stacey, and good evening from Israel. Well, last night and today is quite dramatic, especially when put in the context of the last 3.5 years of instability, constant elections, and quite a lot of divisiveness. It seems that we are on our way to a government, arguably a stable government. As things stand, with about 87 to 88% of the vote counted, the right-wing religious bloc led by Prime Minister Netanyahu has 65 seats, and there is, I think it's 4 or 5 seats for the Hadash-Tal party, which won't sit with either bloc, and the rest goes to basically the current government. What might change in the next few hours, and apparently the Electoral Commission is promising that when we wake up tomorrow in Israel, we will have final results. Not only do they need to count that final 13%, well, within that 13%, I should say, the most important are what's called the double envelopes. And they're called double envelopes because if you do not vote in your home, you vote somewhere else, you put 2 envelopes. What that means is diplomats abroad, people serving in the armed forces, people in care homes, medical centers, people who have corona, people who just simply cannot get home in time. There is a rule that you can just turn up to a certain center, specifically for people with medical or mobility problems, and ask to vote. All you have to do is sign a piece of paper that says that you are in some way disabled. You don't have to prove it. No one is there checking. And the numbers of those has gone up, especially after Corona, when a lot of people basically took advantage of that situation. And a lot of Israelis now know that that is the way you can vote, especially people who are on vacation. A lot of people in Eilat had no intention of going home. They were on vacation. So they just turn up to a local center. Regardless, the fact is that it's going to be around 600,000 votes. Now, that is a significant amount. In the last elections, we saw that the double envelopes didn't dramatically or drastically affect the result. It used to be in the past, when the majority of double envelopes were those serving in the armed forces, that they tended to go on the right, because young 18 to 21-year-olds, especially in Israel, veer to the right. So usually the right-wing parties do very well, the ultra-Orthodox parties less well, and the Arabs less well, because they have less people serving in the armed forces. But these days, because, as I said, it's a much wider group of people, it's possible that it could change the results. Now, what could change? Basically, there's 2 parties which are very close to the threshold. They are Meretz, which is the threshold is 3.25. I believe that they're 3.2 something, very, very close to the threshold. And then there is Balad, an extreme Arab nationalist party, which is on 0.09, I should say, which is a little bit further away. Now, what that means is if both parties were to pass, then Netanyahu would not have a majority. If Meretz were to pass, and again, obviously the rest of the votes could obviously make a difference between the blocks, or not necessarily between the blocks, but within the blocks, then that could put Netanyahu's majority down to 61. As we know, as we've talked many, many times over the previous couple of years during elections, the key number here is to have 61 to be able to have a vote of confidence and form a government. That's what Netanyahu was talking about throughout the elections. We need 61, we need 61. At the moment, he has 65. If all things stand as they are, he has a relatively stable government, because if you have 61, you are beholden to any one MK member of Knesset who decides they don't like this, they want to push forward their particular issue and basically decide not to vote with the government until they get their demands, in other words, blackmailing the system. Netanyahu has seen that himself in the past, and we've seen certainly in this current government how unwieldy a 61 government is and how long it lasted. So Netanyahu will certainly be hoping that Meretz will remain under the threshold, that Balad will remain under the threshold, and he can get to 65, which will give him a nice, healthy government. Other things that could change is that it is possible that Netanyahu and openings are starting already now to look for opportunities to bring people across from the other side. Now, if you look at the parties there, Ram is pretty much out of the question. Labour is pretty much out of the question. Yisrael Beiteinu seems to be pretty much out of the question. Yesh Atid is extremely unlikely. So the main target for Netanyahu is the Gantz-led party, which has Gadi Eisenkot, a former IDF chief of staff, and Gideon Sa'ar. Now, Gideon Sa'ar himself is probably not going to meet any of Netanyahu's overtures. He's someone who has personal differences, ideological differences. Perhaps he's even further to the right than Netanyahu. But there are people that he brought across for his party that no longer exists, that came together with Gantz's party to make the National Unity Party. But his particular part was called Tikva Chadasha, the New Hope, having people like Zev Elkin. And there was a remarkable statistic I read today that Zev Elkin has never sat in the opposition. He's moved around quite a lot in different parties, but the fact that he's never sat in the opposition and always seemed to find his way into the government probably will give some pause within the Likud that he, maybe one or two others within that former Likud members that left with Gideon Sa'ar could perhaps even give him an even stronger majority, especially if his majority is whittled down to 61 or 62. So that's where things stand at the moment. We hope to understand exactly what the results are tomorrow, and then we'll basically be in a process where it's in the hands of the president, Bougie Herzog, Isaac Herzog, who has a ceremonial but a very important position in all this. Once the results are final, he will then invite, he actually could invite even before, which I think he has done in the past, all the leaders of all the factions in the Knesset to ask them who they recommend. And on the basis of that, he will then give one member of Knesset, usually the leader of the largest party and the one most likely to be able to form a government, which as things stand will be Benjamin Netanyahu, 28 days to be able to form a government with 14 more if he so chooses. If he's unable to do so, then you can go for another MK and even a third one. Beyond that, then we go back to elections. What seems to be happening, as opposed to previous rounds where Netanyahu wanted his full 42 days and used them, there does seem to be some urgency in trying to form a government. There's even talk of trying to swear in the new government when the new members of Knesset are going to be sworn in a matter of days. Now, why is there such urgency? As I said, usually this process can take 42 days because there's a lot of laws that come into fruition on January 1st. Also, they have to pass a budget 3 months after the beginning of the year, which is when the previous budget finishes. And there's reforms in the kosher services, in others, which the ultra-Orthodox will want to overturn before they become a fact. While 42 days is before January 1st, you have to also then legislate, you have to overturn laws, you have to, all this process takes time. And especially if you're going to move into ministries, that also is going to take up time. So there does appear to be a large amount of urgency on the part of this government to move things ahead. Now, what are the other problems? Let's first look at the winners and losers. First of all, the biggest winner seems to be Benjamin Netanyahu. He's made this comeback. It's something that we've talked about, and I said on a number of occasions that I believe that that's the most likely outcome. And it seems that Netanyahu was able to rally his voters, especially after, for the first time in 13 years, going into an election as an opposition candidate. He was able to rally his supporters, but most importantly, other parties in his bloc were able to also increase their support. Netanyahu, as things stand, didn't really increase massively the members of Knesset that he'll have, maybe one or two, but where he certainly, his bloc has certainly gained from is the meteoric rise of the Religious Zionist Party. The Religious Zionist Party in the last Knesset, I think, had 7 seats. Today, as things stand, it has 14 seats. Now that is a, it's a massive increase. It's a double of its support, and it becomes the second largest party in a prospective government. And the first time in the history of the state of Israel that a religious Zionist party is the third largest party in the Knesset. So it's a massive achievement for the party of Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir. Now, the fact that especially Itamar Ben-Gvir, who was seen as a pariah by some around the world, is seen as extreme right, there is a certain amount of concern amongst governments. There's even talk of the Biden administration sending messages to Netanyahu that he could be problematic. Perhaps they would boycott him personally. All these things potentially could happen. There is certainly some unease about it, but the fact that he got 14, they got 14 together means that they're pretty much at this point, at least, an inseparable part of a future government. If Gantz's party would have got more than Smotrich Ben-Gvir, then there would have been a lot of pressure for them to replace perhaps the Religious Zionist Party with the National Unity Party of Benny Gantz. But the numbers, certainly, especially if Meretz do pass the electoral threshold, are simply not there to be able to form a government. And Netanyahu will certainly want to form a government. The ultra-Orthodox bloc is certainly another winner. They've increased their support. I think they were on 14 seats and now they're up to 19. Again, these are not final numbers, but certainly it seems that the ultra-Orthodox parties, especially Shas, massively increased. The Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox party, United Torah Judaism, held its number of mandates, but the Shas party, probably the only party that seriously looked at this situation with the cost of with the rise in the cost of living, and really looking at microeconomics and understanding the pain of the people and running a relatively straightforward campaign explaining that that they will change the situation, really improved their support base. And what we've talked about before, as opposed to the United Torah Judaism list, which almost all of its voters are ultra-Orthodox, the Shas has a lot of supporters outside the ultra-Orthodox community, within the religious, within the traditional, and with even the secular Sephardi, Mizrahi population in the development towns and the periphery, etc., etc. Big losers certainly is the bloc led by Yair Lapid. Yair Lapid increased his Knesset representation significantly, but as those to his left would argue, at the cost of being able to block a Netanyahu government. There really wasn't much of a chance of Lapid being able to form a government. The best hope he had was be able to have a blocking majority with the Arab parties that would never sit in a government and probably wouldn't even be able to be relied on, but at least it would keep Netanyahu's bloc under 59. That is what was hoped for. But Lapid, basically, what Labour and Meretz are now claiming is that Lapid cared only about his party and didn't care about the bloc. And because of that, Netanyahu has a significant majority. This is certainly bearing itself out, the fact that Meretz could find itself outside the Knesset, and Labour are down to 4 seats, meaning that the parties to the left of Yesh Atid were sacrificed for a greater Yesh Atid vote. It seems that some of his pollsters and communication strategists got it wrong. They promised, or they suggested, according to their understanding, that Netanyahu would not get a majority and Meretz and Labour would pass the threshold comfortably. And because of that, Lapid did not do what he did in the previous election by calling on some of his voters to also to vote for Labour and Meretz. He didn't do that, even though Meretz especially called for him to do that. And as a result, he has no blocking majority at all. So those are some of the winners and losers. As I said, Meretz at the moment finds itself well below, well, not well below, slightly below the threshold. Ayelet Shaked's Jewish Home Party, which, you know, had never really got that close to crossing the threshold, really failed miserably. I think it only received about 40,000 seats, which I don't even think made 1.5%. I think she got 1.4%, well below the threshold. Now, it turns out there was a bit of controversy today because there was a member of the Likud party, Yoav Kish, who suggested that Shaked's run, at least till the end, had been coordinated with the Likud to basically raise the number of votes, which will obviously change the dynamics between the blocks. And even that 40,000 that came out and voted for Shaked changed the dynamics enough that if the situation stays as is, Meretz's numbers, even though they're relatively high, will not be enough to get over that number because of the total number of votes, leading to the percentages allotted to each party. It was subsequently denied, but the fact that Yoav Kish came out and said it on live TV, and at first Shaked said that was true and then denied it, certainly leads a lot of the intrigue, and it certainly wouldn't surprise me if that was true, because there was never really a chance for Shaked to pass the threshold, but she ran to the end. Perhaps also there's a rule that if you get under 1%, you don't get your deposit back, or some when you enter an election, and that can be significant money. Maybe that's another reason that she ran. But certainly that seems to be perhaps another step to the, even though she failed miserably in the polls, perhaps to her rehabilitation on the right. That's what some are saying. They're saying that Shaked was not promised anything for running to the end, but perhaps the fact that she contributed to a potential right-wing religious government means that perhaps she's on her way to forgiveness. These are some of the intrigues that are behind the scenes. So there's certainly a lot more to talk about, and I'm happy to answer any of your questions. But it does seem that it will be, at this point in time, a lot less complicated to form a government than in all the previous attempts over the last 3 years.
All right, thank you so much. So Earl Simones asks, what is the percentage of people who live in Israel that are able to vote?
Say it again, sorry,
Yeah.
The percentage? That's a good question. I think everyone over the age of 18 is able to vote who's a citizen. I don't know the exact numbers. I think there was something like 6 million. There's something like 6 million and something because Israel has a very young population. And the actual percentage of voting was 67%. So they were talking at one point that it was going to be the highest for a generation. In the end, it wasn't quite there. But interestingly enough, it was the highest turnout since 2015. If we remember 2015, the government just before that was one without the ultra-Orthodox as well, one that held the left-wing Yesh Atid party, one that Netanyahu was trying to break up from the moment of its inception. So, it seems that, a number of those parties that had to, on the right, in the religious camp, who had to sit in the opposition, again, were able to rally their people and say, this government is not what we wanted. If you want to change, you've got to come out and vote. And it did seem that as I said, the representation of the ultra-Orthodox community, especially, interestingly enough, they're talking on the news that certain sects within the Hasidic community, because as we know, the ultra-Orthodox community is split into various sectors. The Hasidic community, some sects within the Hasidic community haven't voted in the past because ideologically they do not believe in it, etc., etc. And some of them actually were told by their rabbis to come out and vote for the first time, which also led to an increase in their support.
Thank you. If you don't mind, can we dive a little deeper into that? That was my next question. What exactly can we infer from there being such a high percentage of voters this round?
As I said, this is the first election in 13 years where Netanyahu and the right-wing religious bloc were in the opposition. And from the day that the government was formed, the current government, soon probably to be ended, was formed, there was a delegitimization political attacks, that this is a left wing, it's failing. It failed. These are the arguments: failed on Corona, failed on the economy. It had Ram, which is an Islamist party, even though its leader had been legitimized by Netanyahu previously and had crossed the Rubicon, as they said, and admitted that Israel was a Jewish state, said all the right things, but the fact is that it was still delegitimized as a party associated with the Muslim Brotherhood, and the fact that the government had Meretz and Labour and Yesh Atid, it was constantly being called left-wing, even though it also had right-wing and centrist elements, and it really managed to galvanize the right wing. The right wing is a motivated wing, and when they're in power, especially in the last elections, they didn't come out as much. Maybe many just thought that they didn't necessarily need to, but a year and a half in the opposition with the constant attacks, with the constant delegitimization, meant that it really ensured that the ultra-Orthodox party, again, who need to be in the government because their interests are less ideological, less about security issues, but more about having access to budgets for their yeshivot, and making sure that the community doesn't go to the army. They have control over religious issues like kashrut, like wedding, divorce, etc., which also there'd been some changes with this current government. So they were able to rally their voters to go out in much higher numbers, which also, as we said, led to the Religious Zionist Party doubling its representation as well, because they care about these issues. They care about the Jewish identity of the state of Israel. They care about religion state issues, and they care about security issues.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. An anonymous attendee asked, could we accept last summer's terrorism attacks as a meaningful factor in the right-wing landslide?
It depends which attacks you're talking about. Interestingly enough, they did show, I saw some statistics earlier, in the mixed cities, don't forget, during the last Operation Guardian of the Walls, which was actually led by Netanyahu, the previous government, not the current one now, the previous one led by Netanyahu, where there was a lot of riots, pogroms, whatever you want to call it, even murders of Jews in mixed cities and Arab rioting, etc. It was in these cities that we saw a massive rise in the right wing. We also saw a massive rise on the Arab side in these mixed cities, voting for more extreme Arab parties. So probably, you can go back to those sort of moments, and there's a rise on the right in the Jewish sectors within these cities, but also a rise in the far right in the Arab sectors. So that also probably led to it, and the fact that there's been terrorist attacks, there's been rockets launched from Gaza pretty much under every government, for a number of years. But obviously every attack which takes place under a government which has been called left-wing and weak and concessionary and the rest of it obviously adds up. So certainly the fact that there were a number of terrorist attacks and there were murders, earlier in the year, certainly played into this. One could also argue that the current government has actually been pretty strong on security. There hasn't been a day, especially over the last few months, where the IDF has not been in the major cities making arrests, taking out terrorist organizations. So both sides could say that they're stronger than the other on security, but at the end of the day, the right wing made a more powerful case to the public, as is seen by the numbers.
Thank you. Jack Wasserman asked, Netanyahu said he would neutralize the maritime deal with Lebanon. What would that mean?
It's an interesting one, because he didn't say that he would cancel it. He said he would neutralize it, which is a term that can mean so many different things, and purposefully so. I don't believe that they're going to cancel it. It's not a major issue, and I think if it's not dealt with, I don't think there'll be too many cries from within the right-wing religious bloc. Perhaps they feel that there's bigger fish to fry. I don't see them cancelling it at this point. The Israeli government has already signed on to it, so it would mean quite a lot of activity to undo it. And again, a lot of things that are said during election season aren't necessarily going to take place. Netanyahu said in the past he would place sovereignty over Judea and Samaria. He would take down the illegal Palestinian settlement of Khan al-Ahmar. It stood for many, many years under a Netanyahu government. So I would take with a pinch of salt a lot of things that are said during elections. But it's possible that they do have some plans to at least deal with it in one way. But I'd be quite surprised if it was completely cancelled from the Israeli point of view.
Thank you. And Stuart Broad asked, do you believe that there will be any appreciable change in Netanyahu's policy towards Iran's nuclear weapons program vis-a-vis Lapid's?
Probably not. Netanyahu has been criticized in the past for using a different tone, especially with the American administration picking more open battles. But I think essentially, it's the same. They're trying to stop it diplomatically, perhaps, behind the scenes militarily. So I don't think it will be markedly different. Perhaps the diplomatic approach, the tone will be different. But the fact is also what's playing into that is the fact that the return to the JCPOA seems to be very far from the table at this point, especially with the basic reports that Iran is helping Russia in its drone attacks on Ukraine. This has certainly enraged many parts of the West, including the US. So at the moment, even according to Mali, I can't remember his first name, who's known to be one of the more dovish members of the administration on this, he's in fact leading the negotiations and is very keen to get back to the JCPOA, has admitted that there's just nothing on it at the moment. The Americans are not even, they're looking at many other things to do with Iran, and certainly not a return to the JCPOA, but obviously things can change relatively quickly.
Absolutely. Edward Lipson asked, do you anticipate a difference in policy towards Ukraine with a new right-wing government?
That's an interesting question. Netanyahu has prided himself in the past on having a good relationship with Putin. And he even did attack sometimes this government for its position on it. But, it's very easy to attack from the opposition. At the end of the day, the position is relative, it's the same position. Israel has to really navigate very carefully, first of all, because, Russia is next door in Syria, and Israel's interest in ensuring that Iran doesn't have access to the border with Israel with all its capabilities to attack and terrorize the people of Israel is the primary factor. The second one is there's a very large Jewish community in Russia that it has to keep an eye over, and certainly shouldn't antagonize the Putin government too much. That is kind of like the approach I think most prime ministers will take, while trying to help Ukraine as much as possible, as this government has done, but not sending anything, let's say, of a aggressive military nature. It certainly has provided intelligence, especially on the Iranian drone infrastructure, and it has helped defensive, and it has set up a hospital, and it's done more than probably most countries in the world. But it knows that there's a line that it cannot cross, because Russia have gained very close relationships recently with a lot of Israel's opponents and enemies, and it has to tread very, very carefully in this area. So I can't imagine that too much will change there.
Thank you. And how do you foresee the relationship with Netanyahu seems pretty set in being prime minister right now, correct? Yeah. Okay. How do you see the relationship with
that?
Absolutely, yes. So how do you see the relationship going forward with President Biden?
Well, they know each other. There's a respect there. There's not necessarily agreements. I think there was a comment that Biden made a number of years ago, said, "I don't agree with you, Bibi, but I love you." Something like that. I can't remember. It's sort of that folksy tone that President Biden uses. So they'll know each other. They'll be very aware of each other. It's no secret that the Biden administration would have preferred Lapid to continue as prime minister. They were quite happy with this government. They certainly will be less happy with what seems to be a potential right-wing religious government. As I said, they have certain concerns, to put it in diplomatic language, about some of the elements within. But at the end of the day, the relationship between the Americans and the Israelis goes beyond individuals. There's a lot of cooperation there. There's a lot of understanding. So I think it will go fine. But again, it all depends how much push there is from the far right within the government. If there is a push to expand settlement building, if there's a push to even put sovereignty, if there's a push to take a harsher hand against Palestinians or Israeli Arabs within Israel, then I think Netanyahu will see quite a lot of pushback from the Biden administration.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So we've come to the close of our webinar and podcast. Thank you, Ashley, for taking time to update us this week. For our viewers and listeners, please join us Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern for a webinar with Jonathan Spire discussing, is Erdogan's Turkey aiding in jihadist takeover of northeast Syria? Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.